He slammed her face into her food in front of a packed diner, mocking her as the crowd froze. What he didn't know was that Keanu Reeves was sitting just a few feet away, and in the next moments, the entire room would witness a response they'd never forget. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The late lunch rush at Rosie's Diner had its own rhythm. Plates clinked, coffee poured endlessly, and the low hum of conversations filled the air like a gentle backdrop to the warm smell of grilled burgers and fresh pie. At a corner booth near the window, Ronda Rousey sat with a close friend, dressed down in a gray hoodie and worn ball cap. She had no desire for public attention that day, just a quiet meal and some laughter away from the noise of cameras and the world's expectations. They were mid-story, sharing a laugh, when the entire room's mood shifted. The doors slammed open with a metallic clang, letting in a gust of warm Los Angeles air. In stepped a man who carried himself with the arrogance of someone used to being obeyed. Detective Harris wasn't in uniform, but everything about him screamed law enforcement. The squared shoulders, the clipped walk, the badge clipped to his belt like a silent warning. His expression was sour, his jaw tight. He didn't so much walk through the diner as he pushed through it, brushing against customers without apology. "Unbelievable," he muttered loud enough for half the diner to hear, his voice dripping with irritation. His eyes locked on the counter where a young waitress was struggling to balance a tray of drinks. He strode over and leaned across the counter, his voice cutting through the room. "I've been waiting outside for 15 minutes for my order. 15 minutes, he barked. "And you still can't get it right? What kind of service is this?" The waitress, a girl barely in her 20s with tired eyes and hair pulled into a loose ponytail, stammered in apology. She explained the kitchen was backed up, but Harris wasn't listening. His voice grew louder, his words sharper, his presence swallowing up the air around him. Other diners glanced over, but quickly looked away. No one wanted to invite trouble. At the corner booth, Ronda watched, her jaw tightening. She'd been on the receiving end of public humiliation before, but seeing it happen to someone powerless lit a fire in her chest. She pushed back her chair and stood, crossing the few steps to the counter. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but there was steel underneath. "Hey," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "That's enough." The room seemed to pause. Harris turned slowly, his eyes scanning her face. Recognition flickered, and then a smirk. "Well, if it isn't the great Ronda Rousey," he said mockingly. "Didn't think you'd still show your face in public after that last fight." Rinda didn't flinch. She'd heard worse from critics who hid behind screens, but the sharpness in his tone wasn't about banter. It was about dominance. The waitress took a hesitant step back, glancing between them as if weighing whether she should intervene or disappear into the kitchen. "Go back to your table," Harris said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This doesn't concern you." "It does," Ronda replied evenly, "when you start tearing into someone just trying to do her job." The smirk on his face hardened into something meaner. "What are you going to do, armbar me, right here in front of everybody?" His eyes glimmered with the kind of arrogance that didn't come from confidence, but from a belief in immunity. He shifted closer, his frame towering over her, the smell of coffee and stale cologne hanging between them. Randa kept her voice steady. "I don't need to do anything except tell you to back off." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think you're still somebody," he sneered. "You're just a washed-up fighter trying to play hero." Before anyone could react, Harris moved, fast and deliberate. His hand shot forward, gripping the back of Ronda's head. With one violent shove, he slammed her face into her plate. The sound of ceramics scraping the table rang through the diner, followed by the muffled gasp of the crowd. Food scattered across the table, her drink tipping over and spilling onto the floor. A woman at the next booth covered her mouth in shock. The waitress froze, eyes wide, tray still in her hands. Somewhere in the back, a cook shouted, "Hey!" but didn't dare come out. Ronda pushed herself back, wiping mashed avocado and eggs from her face, her breathing controlled but sharp. Harris loomed over her, satisfied, like a bully who believed the fight was already over. That's when a subtle movement caught his attention. A chair sliding back from a table just a few feet away. Slowly, Harris turned his head, and the atmosphere in the diner seemed to shift yet again. Seated there, dressed in a plain black t-shirt and jeans, was Keanu Reeves. He had been quietly finishing his coffee, a script folded beside him, but now his gaze was locked on Harris. His expression wasn't one of outrage or fury, it was something colder, steadier. His eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw set, as though measuring the space between them. Keanu didn't speak right away. The low hum of the diner seemed to fade under the weight of the silence between them. Harris shifted slightly, his earlier bravado flickering in the presence of a man whose calm was far more unsettling than rage. A few customers had pulled out their phones, unsure whether to record or stay out of it. Others simply sat frozen, eyes darting between the cop and the actor they never expected to see here. Keanu's gaze moved briefly to Ronda. She was already straightening in her seat, brushing the last bits of food from her hoodie. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, enough to communicate that she didn't need pity, only truth. Harris seemed to regain his footing, mistaking Keanu's silence for hesitation. "What?" he barked, his voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "You got something to say?" Keanu finally stood. He didn't rush it. He placed a couple of bills under his coffee cup, pushed the chair back fully, and stepped forward. There was a stillness to his movements, the kind that made people lean in without realizing it. He stopped just inside Harris's personal space. "You should think carefully about your next move," Keanu said, his tone measured but firm. "Because right now, everyone here is watching who you really are." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The weight of them settled over the room like a thick fog. Harris blinked, the faintest trace of uncertainty slipping into his expression. Ronda stood now too, wiping her hands with a napkin, her posture squared. The waitress hovered behind the counter, caught between fear and relief that someone had stepped in. Keanu didn't break eye contact with Harris. "Sit down. Walk away. Or prove to everyone here that your badge means you're above the law." For a moment, the air felt brittle, as though it could snap with the wrong word. Harris's jaw tightened, his hands flexing at his sides. The decision was his, but the power in the room had shifted. In the corner, an elderly man whispered to his wife, "He has no idea who he's dealing with." The scene hung in suspension. The arrogant cop, the bruised fighter, and the quiet actor whose presence had turned the tide. He had no idea who was sitting right behind him, until it was too late. The morning sun in Los Angeles had a crisp clarity to it, the kind that made even the busiest streets look washed in gold. Keanu Reeves had kept his schedule intentionally light that day. There were no red carpet events, no media obligations, just a quiet meeting with a small youth charity tucked away in a worn brick building on the east side. The program worked with teenagers from difficult backgrounds, offering mentorship, free classes, and a place to feel safe. Keanu had been involved for years, mostly behind the scenes, but every few months he made time to stop in. That morning, he sat with the kids in their cramped art room, talking about movies, but more importantly, about choices, how every decision, big or small, shapes the path ahead. After the visit, he walked out to a cool breeze drifting through the city. He had the rest of the afternoon free, and his driver asked if he wanted to head back to the hotel. Keanu hesitated, then smiled slightly. "No, let's take a detour." He had a place in mind, a small diner on the corner of Melrose and 8th. Back in his early acting days, when money was tight and roles were scarce, he'd eat there for under $5. The same red vinyl booths, the same creaky ceiling fan that seemed to run year-round. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. By the time he stepped inside, the lunch rush was in full swing. The smell of grilled onions and fresh coffee hung in the air. Regulars filled the booths, chatting over sandwiches, and a jukebox in the corner played a faded, classic rock tune. Keanu slipped into a booth near the back, ordering just a coffee at first. Across the city, Ronda Rousey was also keeping her day quiet. The media had been relentless since her last public appearance, and the thought of facing another crowd of photographers was exhausting. She pulled on a hoodie and a baseball cap, texted her friend to meet her for lunch, and picked a place she thought would be low-key enough to avoid attention. The diner seemed perfect. She slid into a booth near the far corner, laughing with her friend over an inside joke. For a while, it felt like they could simply blend in, but that fragile peace would shatter the moment Detective Harris walked in. Detective Harris was the kind of man whose presence filled a room, not because of charisma, but because of the heavy weight of his arrogance. Even out of uniform, his demeanor carried the authority of someone used to barking orders and having them obeyed without question. He shoved open the diner door so hard it rattled the frame, the little brass bell above it clanging sharply against the glass. His eyes swept the room in a quick, dismissive glance. The regulars looked away, focusing on their plates. No one wanted to be noticed by Harris. He was known in the neighborhood not as a hero of the badge, but as a man with a temper. Stories of his short fuse and heavy-handed behavior had made the rounds, but no one ever challenged him, at least not in public. He strode toward the counter, pushing past a man carrying a tray of burgers and ignoring the startled protest. The waitress behind the counter, a young woman with tired eyes and a polite smile, was juggling orders, coffee refills, and the steady hum of customers needing her attention. Harris slapped his hand on the counter, startling her. "You planning to get me my food sometime this decade?" His voice was loud enough to turn heads. The waitress tried to explain that she was working through orders as quickly as possible, but Harris leaned in, his voice dropping into a sharper, more condescending tone. Ronda noticed the shift immediately. She had dealt with intimidation before, inside and outside the ring, but something about watching it happen to someone just doing their job made her sit up straighter. Her friend's smile faded as they exchanged a look, the kind that silently asks, "Are you going to say something?" Keanu, from his booth at the back, also caught the exchange. He didn't move, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Years in the public eye had taught him to be cautious, to read a situation before acting. Harris's posture was aggressive, his jaw tight. This wasn't about a late order, it was about dominance. The waitress tried again to calm him, but Harris leaned back, scoffing loudly, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. The room's warm, easy energy had shifted into something tense and brittle. Forks hovered over plates, conversations stalled. And while Ronda didn't yet know it, her decision to speak up would draw two paths, hers and Keanu's, straight into collision. Ronda took a slow breath, her hand curling loosely around her water glass as she weighed whether to intervene. She had promised herself she wouldn't attract attention today, not after the week she'd had in the tabloids. But the sound of the waitress's strained politeness made something in her tighten. Her friend leaned forward and murmured, "Don't. Not worth it." But Ronda's eyes stayed on Harris. She wasn't thinking about headlines or cameras. She was thinking about fairness. At the far booth, Keanu sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on the reflection in the chrome trim of the counter. He had learned to read body language from years on film sets and in martial arts training, and Harris's was loud without a word. Squared shoulders, forward lean, a subtle crowding of space. All dominance, no respect. Keanu had seen men like him before, in and out of Hollywood. He had also seen how quickly they could push a situation from tense to dangerous. The waitress glanced toward the kitchen for backup, but the cooks were busy with orders and oblivious to the rising temperature out front. Harris tapped his fingers on the counter in a steady, impatient rhythm. It wasn't the first time he had been in here. A couple of regulars exchanged knowing looks but kept their heads down. Everyone had their own story about him. A traffic stop that turned ugly, a neighbor dispute that ended with him shouting in someone's driveway, yet he always walked away without consequence. Keanu, meanwhile, had come here looking for a moment of peace after a long morning meeting about a new community center project. This diner had been a part of his early Los Angeles life, a place he had visited before the fame, before the cameras. Back then, it had been where he could order eggs and coffee for under $5 and read a script in the corner without being noticed. Coming back now felt like touching an old photograph. Across town earlier, Ronda had been enjoying the same kind of quiet, the kind she had been missing. After weeks of public speculation about her career, she wanted nothing more than a low-key lunch, with a friend who wouldn't ask about the last fight or her future in MMA. Neither she nor Keanu had planned to be part of anyone else's story today. But the arrival of Detective Harris was about to change the rhythm of that afternoon, and the air in the diner was already shifting towards something neither of them could ignore. The plate clattered as Ronda's face hit it, the sound sharp enough to slice through the chatter of the diner. Sauce smeared across her cheek and into her hair, a mix of heat and humiliation burning her skin. For a heartbeat, the entire place seemed suspended. Forks hovering mid-air, conversations cut off mid-sentence. She sat up slowly, the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her back. Her breathing was steady, almost too steady, but her hands betrayed her. They trembled slightly as she reached for a napkin, wiping the mess from her face with deliberate, unhurried motions. She didn't speak, she didn't shout, but when she looked at Harris, her gaze locked on his with the precision of a fighter measuring distance before a strike. Harris leaned forward, the smirk already curling his lips. The arrogance in his eyes was thick enough to taste. He bent down just close enough that his breath brushed her ear. His words were low, meant only for her, but the cruelty in his tone was unmistakable. It was the kind of remark meant to cut deeper than a shove ever could. A few tables away, Keanu's fingers rested lightly on the handle of his coffee cup. The faint scrape of ceramic against the wooden table broke the stillness as he set it down. He rose slowly, not in a rush, his movement deliberate, each step calculated. His eyes were steady, fixed on Harris, with a calm intensity that carried more weight than any raised voice could. The waitress, her face pale and lips pressed tight, instinctively took a step toward them. The scene unfolding in front of her was one she wanted to stop, to de-escalate before it spiraled. But when Keanu glanced her way and gave the slightest shake of his head, she froze. It wasn't a command, it was reassurance, a quiet promise that he would take care of it. Around them, the air was thick with the kind of silence that amplifies every sound. A chair creaked in the corner, someone's spoon slipped into a coffee cup with a faint clink. All eyes followed Keanu as he closed the distance. The steady rhythm of his footsteps, a stark contrast to the tension knotting the room. Harris straightened up, still looming over Ronda, not yet aware of the shadow now falling across his back. Harris didn't turn immediately. His focus was still locked on Ronda, his posture dripping with the confidence of a man used to getting his way without consequence. He chuckled under his breath, the kind of laugh meant to humiliate, as if the entire moment was nothing more than a joke for his own amusement. But then, without warning, he felt the subtle shift, the sensation of someone standing behind him. It wasn't a loud interruption, no shouted words to announce a challenge, just a quiet, steady presence. Harris turned his head slightly, enough to catch the faint reflection of a tall figure in the glass of the pie display at the counter. Keanu stood there, shoulders squared but relaxed, his hands hanging loose at his sides. His expression wasn't angry, at least not in the obvious way. It was a look of contained resolve, a calm that felt far more dangerous than any raised fist. "Is there a problem here?" Keanu's voice was low, almost conversational, but there was an undertone that made the words land like an unspoken warning. Harris turned fully now, sizing up the man in front of him. For a flicker of a second, recognition passed across his features, though he masked it quickly with a scoff. "This doesn't concern you," he said, tilting his head toward Ronda in a way that dismissed both of them at once. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "It does now," he said, the words quiet but immovable. The customers at nearby tables leaned forward ever so slightly, drawn into the invisible line being drawn between the two men. Ronda, still seated, watched in silence. She could have stood up and defended herself. She had the skill, the training, the history. But something about Keanu's demeanor made her pause. This wasn't about who could throw the harder punch. It was about control. Harris shifted his stance, squaring up instinctively. His hand twitched toward his belt, a movement subtle but noticed. Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he took one slow step forward, closing the distance to the point where Harris had to tilt his head back slightly to meet his eyes. The energy in the diner tightened further. Conversations that had started to whisper died off again. The only sound now was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner, a mechanical rhythm beneath the human tension. Harris's smirk faltered, though he tried to hide it beneath a veneer of arrogance. "You really want to get involved in this?" he asked, his voice lower now, but still sharp with condescension. Keanu's reply came after a brief pause, measured and deliberate. "I think you've already involved me," he said, glancing briefly at Ronda before locking eyes with Harris again. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Even the clink of utensils from the kitchen had stopped. The waitress, still standing near the counter, gripped her notepad so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She didn't know whether to intervene or just stay still and let whatever was about to happen unfold. Renda slowly dabbed the last of the sauce from her cheek with a napkin, her gaze fixed on Harris. "You're embarrassing yourself," she said calmly, her tone devoid of anger but full of weight. Harris's jaw tensed. He didn't like being talked to that way, especially not by someone he had just tried to humiliate. "Careful," he warned, though the warning lacked the conviction it might have carried earlier. Keanu took another step forward, his presence now a wall between Harris and Ronda. "No," he said evenly. "I think you should be careful." The words weren't shouted, but they carried through the diner like a bell. They had the kind of gravity that made people stop and think, not because they were threatening, but because they were absolute. Harris's eyes flicked around the diner, noting the patrons watching him, some with phones in hand, clearly recording. His control of the situation was slipping, and he knew it. The confidence he'd walked in with was eroding with every second. Keanu stood there. In the tense stillness, Keanu didn't move to touch him. He didn't raise his voice or make a sudden gesture. He simply held his ground until Harris stepped back a fraction, his weight shifting as if he'd been physically pushed without a single hand being laid on him. The spell wasn't broken, but something had shifted. The balance of power had quietly but completely changed, and for the first time since entering the diner, Detective Harris seemed unsure of what to do next. Keanu closed the remaining distance until only a few feet stood between him and Harris. The detective's shoulders squared instinctively, like a man used to asserting dominance, but Keanu's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle him more than any aggressive stance would have. Despite his huddled, Keanu tried to remain. "Was that necessary?" Keanu asked, his voice level, almost conversational. Yet the question cut through the tension like a blade. Harris let out a short, mocking laugh, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a naive onlooker. "Oh, here we go," he said with exaggerated annoyance. "Another hero sticking his nose where it doesn't belong." His tone dripped with sarcasm, each word meant to diminish the man standing in front of him. From her booth, Ronda tilted her head slightly, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. She recognized something in Keanu's posture. Not the readiness of a fighter looking for a brawl, but the unshakable composure of someone who understood control, both over himself and over the room. The rest of the diner remained in total silence. Forks were suspended in midair. Coffee cups were paused halfway to lips. Even the air felt heavier, as though the entire place was collectively waiting for a spark to ignite the standoff. Harris took a deliberate step forward, closing the gap to just inches. His frame loomed slightly over Keanu's, but the difference in presence was striking. Keanu didn't so much as blink. His feet stayed planted, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze steady. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Harris said quietly, his breath laced with the faint scent of coffee and something sharper, like whiskey. The words were meant as a warning, but they landed hollow against Keanu's stillness. "Don't need to," Keanu replied. The simplicity of his answer seemed to irritate Harris even more. Ronda's friend shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at the door as if weighing whether to leave before things escalated. But Ronda's attention never wavered from the two men. She could sense Keanu wasn't bluffing. His presence alone was a wall Harris couldn't easily push through. "You should walk away right now," Keanu said finally, each word deliberate, spaced just enough to allow its weight to sink in. For a moment, Harris's jaw clenched, his eyes searching Keanu's face for any sign of weakness. He found none. The silence stretched, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Then, with a dismissive scoff, Harris turned his back. "Get lost," he muttered, stepping back toward the counter and barking his food order to the still shaken waitress. It was a retreat disguised as dismissal, but no one in the diner was fooled. Keanu didn't move to follow him. Not yet. He simply stood where he was, his gaze lingering on Harris for a beat longer before finally turning to glance at Ronda, as if to silently check if she was all right. Ronda straightened slowly in her seat, brushing crumbs and sauce from the front of her hoodie. She gave Keanu a subtle nod, acknowledging his silent question. There was no fear in her expression now, only a guarded alertness. The waitress, still pale and trembling, took a cautious step back from the counter, her eyes flicking between Keanu and Harris as though unsure what to do next. Keanu gave her the faintest shake of his head, a quiet signal to stand down. Harris leaned against the counter, one elbow propped carelessly, but his posture was forced. The muscles in his jaw were still tight, his shoulders hunched ever so slightly forward. He spoke to the waitress in a tone that was more clipped now, the bluster dimmed but not gone. "Double cheeseburger, extra onions," he muttered. Then, with a pointed glance toward Keanu, he added, "And make it quick." Keanu didn't respond to the provocation. His silence wasn't avoidance, it was control. Around the diner, patrons began exchanging wary glances, a few murmuring under their breath. Some recognized Ronda and were still reeling from seeing her attacked. Others recognized Keanu and were trying to piece together what was about to happen next. Ronda's friend shifted again, clearly restless. "You don't have to do this," she whispered toward Keanu, just loud enough for him to hear. Keanu's eyes didn't leave Harris. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you do." The words weren't for Harris. They were for the room. A quiet statement that seemed to settle over everyone present. The hum of tension remained, but it shifted slightly, the fear mixing with a strange kind of anticipation. Harris turned just enough to throw Keanu a sidelong glance. "You think you're going to scare me, pal?" His smirk returned, though it looked thinner now, more brittle. "This is my city. I can do whatever I want." "That's where you're wrong," Keanu replied, still steady, still calm. For a fleeting moment, something unguarded passed over Harris's face. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. Recognition that this man wasn't a passerby he could push around. Ronda leaned forward slightly, studying Keanu's stance, the way he measured his breathing, the way his body never seemed to waste a movement. She had seen enough fighters to know the difference between someone bluffing and someone in control. The waitress finally slid Harris's plate across the counter, the dish clinking softly against the surface. Harris grabbed it and muttered a short, "About time," before turning his back to Keanu again. Keanu didn't follow. Instead, he let the space breathe, his stillness holding the room in a balance that could tip at any second. Harris took the first bite of his burger without turning around, his shoulders squared, as if daring anyone to interrupt him again. Grease dripped onto the paper wrapper, and the sound of chewing was almost too loud in the strained silence. Keanu stayed in place, a measured distance behind him, his hands loose at his sides. He wasn't leaning forward or tensing his body, just present, steady, and impossible to ignore. Ronda's friend whispered something under her breath, but Ronda didn't respond. Her gaze flicked between Harris and Keanu, reading the currents beneath the surface. She could tell Harris was pretending to be more relaxed than he was. Every few seconds, his eyes darted to the side, checking the mirror behind the counter, where Keanu's reflection stood like a shadow. The waitress busied herself with refilling a coffee pot, but her hands still shook. She deliberately avoided stepping between the two men, aware that one wrong move might spark something worse. Finally, Harris set his burger down and turned halfway toward Keanu. "You're still here," he said with a half laugh, trying to make it sound casual. "What is this, some kind of intimidation thing?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Call it whatever you want." "All right then. I'll call it pointless," Harris shot back, leaning in slightly. "You think you're protecting her? She's a fighter, isn't she? Let her fight her own battles." "That wasn't a fight," Keanu said. "That was you abusing someone because you thought you could." For a heartbeat, Harris's smirk faltered. The words landed heavier than he expected. But pride pushed him forward, and he scoffed again. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Keanu's expression didn't change. "Neither do you." A ripple moved through the diner, the kind that happens when people sense a line has been drawn in permanent ink. No one spoke. No one moved. Ronda slowly wiped her hands on a napkin, eyes locked on Harris, waiting. She didn't need to jump in yet. She knew Keanu's restraint wasn't weakness. Harris straightened, trying to reclaim some ground. "This conversation's over." Keanu gave a small nod. "It is, and you should walk away now." The words hung in the air like a final warning. Harris grabbed his burger again, turning his back with exaggerated indifference, but his posture betrayed him. His shoulders were tight, his movements sharper. Keanu stepped back just enough to give space, but not so far that the tension eased entirely. The room exhaled, but only slightly. Everyone knew this wasn't finished. And somewhere deep down, so did Harris. The sound in the diner shifted from tense silence to low, buzzing whispers. At first, it was just a murmur between tables, but soon the air was filled with soft exchanges, voices trying to stay discreet, but unable to hide their curiosity. "That's Keanu Reeves," a man at the counter whispered to the woman next to him, his eyes darting toward the booth where Keanu sat. "And that's Ronda Rousey," the woman replied, her voice tight with disbelief. What on earth just happened? Two men in work uniforms seated near the back leaned toward each other. One muttered about how Harris had a reputation for pushing his authority, while the other quietly admitted he'd never seen anyone stand up to him like that. In the corner, a teenager with a backward cap and wide eyes was already holding up his phone, recording. His thumbs moved quickly, uploading the video clip before he even thought to order food. The caption he typed was short and explosive. "Cop attacks Ronda Rousey in a diner. Keanu Reeves steps in." Within minutes, the video began pinging across social media, notifications stacked on his phone so quickly that the screen lit up nonstop. Outside, people walking past the diner slowed down, checking their phones as the clip spread. Some doubled back to peer through the windows, curious to see if what they'd just watched was still unfolding. Ronda sat back in her booth, the weight of dozens of eyes on her. She took a napkin and dabbed at the sauce streaked across her cheek. It wasn't the mess that bothered her. She'd taken far worse in the ring. But the humiliation of it, the way it happened out of nowhere. She wasn't used to feeling blindsided in public, and yet there was something different in her expression now. Beneath the simmering frustration was a spark of admiration. She had seen men try to confront people like Harris before, and usually they went at him with anger, all heat and no control. But Keanu? He carried himself with a stillness that was almost disarming. Harris kept eating, but the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed him. He knew the room was watching, and the quiet wasn't in his favor. Keanu eased back into his seat, but his gaze never left Harris. He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and placed the cup down again. It wasn't aggression. It was something more unsettling, a calm that made it impossible to tell what he would do next. From the booth across the aisle, a mother leaned in to her teenage daughter and whispered, "Stay close to me." She didn't know where this was going, but she could feel the air getting heavier with every passing second. Outside, more faces pressed against the glass, the crowd growing. Something was building. The teenager's video had already hit thousands of views, and the diner hadn't even returned to normal conversation. Every clink of silverware felt exaggerated, every shuffle of feet like a drumbeat in the room's charged atmosphere. Near the door, a man in a suit who had been quietly eating now slipped outside, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, urgent, and though no one could hear his exact words, it was obvious he was telling someone important what was happening inside. Ronda glanced toward the window and caught sight of the crowd outside. Some were holding up their phones, filming through the glass. Her jaw tightened. She'd dealt with being a public spectacle before, but this wasn't a sports arena or a movie premiere. This was a private lunch turned into a stage for a stranger's abuse. Harris seemed oblivious to the scale of what was unfolding. He waved at the waitress impatiently, barking for more coffee, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The waitress, pale and visibly shaken, avoided his eyes, nodding quickly and retreating toward the counter. Keanu's attention flicked to her, reading her unease. He didn't say anything, but the shift in his posture was subtle. Straighter, more alert. Ronda noticed it too, a small crease forming between her brows. She was starting to understand that Keanu wasn't just sitting back to avoid conflict, he was watching for the right moment. At another table, two college students debated quietly over whether to call the police. One of them pointed out the irony. Harris was the police, or close enough to it. And the other shook his head, saying it didn't matter, someone had to step in before it got worse. The atmosphere had split into two energies. Inside, people tried to pretend they weren't staring while staying hyper-aware of every movement. Outside, the growing crowd was waiting for the next dramatic turn, like a live show playing behind glass. One older man, a regular at the diner, took off his cap and muttered under his breath about how Harris had been getting away with this kind of thing for years. His friend beside him nodded grimly, adding, "Maybe this time's different." Keanu leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his eyes still fixed on Harris. The calmness in his face was almost unnerving. It wasn't a stare meant to provoke, but one that carried a quiet warning. Ronda shifted in her seat, running a hand over her hair, still feeling the sting of humiliation. She wasn't afraid. She'd never been wired that way, but she was beginning to wonder if Harris even understood who he'd just shoved. And then, just as the waitress returned with Harris's coffee, someone in the crowd outside knocked on the glass. The sound made Harris glance toward the window for the first time, and when he saw the phones, his smirk faltered. Harris's eyes narrowed as he spotted the sea of lenses pointed at him from outside. He straightened his jacket as if to reassert his authority, but the change in his expression was impossible to miss. For the first time since entering the diner, he looked unsettled. He turned toward the teenager in the corner, still filming. "Turn that off," Harris barked, his voice low but sharp. The teenager froze for a moment, then glanced around, clearly weighing whether to obey. Before he could decide, a woman from another table spoke up. Why, so no one sees what you just did? Her words cut through the silence, drawing a ripple of murmurs. Harris shot her a glare, but when his gaze swept over the rest of the room, he saw nothing but wary, watchful eyes. People weren't just customers anymore. They were witnesses. Ronda caught the moment, leaning back in her seat, and for the first time since the incident, a faint smirk touched her lips. She didn't need to swing a fist to make a point. The truth was already on display. Keanu remained still, though his eyes never left Harris. He didn't flinch when Harris shifted his stance, trying to tower over the room again. Instead, Keanu's calm stare seemed to anchor everyone in place. Without a single word, he made it clear that intimidation wasn't going to work here. Outside, the crowd was growing thicker, pressing closer to the glass. The murmur of voices rose, mingling with the occasional shout of a name, Ronda or Keanu. The people outside didn't know the full story yet, but they could feel the tension radiating from inside. The waitress returned again, this time not with coffee but with a small plate for Keanu. She set it down quietly, her eyes darting to Harris before quickly moving away. It was a small act, but Keanu acknowledged it with a nod, almost like he was telling her, "You're doing fine." Harris shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the control he thought he had was slipping. He turned back toward the counter, muttering something under his breath, and pretended to check his phone. At that moment, Ronda wiped her hands on a napkin, folded it deliberately, and placed it on the table. She didn't need to raise her voice to make her presence known. Just sitting upright and facing Harris directly was enough to draw the eyes of everyone in the room back to her. The teenager in the corner captured it all. Harris avoiding her gaze, Keanu steady and unyielding, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Outside, a police cruiser slowed as it passed, the officer inside glancing toward the window. The crowd shifted, eager to see what would happen next. Inside, the air felt electric, every second stretching longer than the last. The confrontation wasn't over. If anything, it was only just beginning. The air in the diner seemed to grow heavier as Harris shifted his attention back to Ronda. His lips curled into a smirk that carried no warmth, only cruelty. "Guess your family must be real proud," he said, dragging out each word. "Watching you get tossed around in the ring, and now in a cheap diner?" His tone dripped with mockery, the kind designed to dig deep under the skin. Ronda's jaw tightened, but she didn't move. The insult wasn't just about her. It was aimed at everything she valued. Her friend's hand twitched toward her arm as if to steady her, but she kept her focus locked on Harris. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction, not yet. From across the booth, Keanu's chair scraped softly against the floor. It wasn't the kind of movement meant to draw attention, but in the silence that followed Harris's remark, the sound was like a strike of thunder. Keanu rose to his full height, his eyes never leaving Harris, and stepped forward until he was directly between the cop and Ronda. The shift in the room was immediate. Conversation stopped entirely. Even the faint clink of cutlery died out. The cook in the back, who had been sliding a plate onto the service counter, froze mid-motion. Harris looked Keanu over, his smirk widening as if he'd just been handed a new opponent. He took a deliberate step forward, closing the space until their chests were almost touching. The power play was obvious. Harris wanted to see if Keanu would step back. Keanu didn't move. His voice was calm, even measured, but there was a steel edge to it. "You don't put your hands on people like that," he said, each word carrying a quiet weight that cut through the room. Harris's laugh was loud and abrupt, breaking the silence like a hammer shattering glass. "And what are you going to do about it?" he asked, his voice rising enough for the crowd outside to catch the words. His eyes gleamed with the challenge, as if daring Keanu to take the bait. Keanu didn't take it. He didn't shift his stance, didn't even blink. He simply stared at Harris, unflinching, his gaze steady and unyielding. There was no threat in his voice, no boast, no raised fist, just an immovable presence that somehow felt more dangerous than any shouted warning. The quiet stretched on, wrapping around the moment like a tightening rope. Harris opened his mouth again, but something in Keanu's eyes made him pause. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a dawning awareness that the man standing in front of him wasn't going to be pushed, no matter how hard he tried. From the corner of the diner, the teenager's camera was still rolling, capturing every flicker of tension, every unspoken word. Outside, the crowd pressed closer to the windows, their breath fogging the glass. Something was about to give. Harris tilted his head, trying to mask the hesitation creeping into his expression. He straightened his shoulders, puffing out his chest as though the physical display might reassert his dominance. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he muttered, lowering his voice but keeping the challenge sharp. "This is none of your business." Keanu didn't react to the words, only to the intent behind them. "It became my business," he said evenly, "the moment you laid your hands on someone who didn't deserve it." His voice wasn't raised, but every syllable carried an unmistakable authority, the kind that didn't come from a badge or a title. The waitress, who had been frozen behind the counter, found her voice in a small, trembling whisper. "Sir, maybe you should just—" She didn't finish the sentence. Keanu gave her a small shake of his head, a silent signal to step back, his focus never breaking from Harris. Renda shifted in her seat, wiping the last traces of sauce from her cheek. Her eyes stayed locked on the two men, reading the subtleties in their movements the way a fighter reads an opponent in the ring. She recognized what Keanu was doing. He wasn't escalating, but he wasn't backing down either. It was the kind of patience that forced the other person to make the first mistake. The silence between them grew heavy again, stretching into something uncomfortable for everyone else in the diner. Harris broke it with a sharp exhale, a smirk tugging back at his lips. "You don't scare me, pal." Keanu's reply was almost too quiet for the nearest tables to hear. "I'm not trying to." It was a simple statement, but it hit harder than any shouted threat could. His gaze remained steady, unreadable, but there was something in his posture, a quiet readiness, that made Harris's bravado feel increasingly hollow. From the corner, the teenager with the phone whispered to his friend, "This is going viral." He adjusted his angle to make sure both men were in frame, sensing the kind of footage that could explode across every social platform. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. A delivery driver stopped mid-route to join them, standing on his toes to see over the heads pressed to the glass. The scene inside the diner had taken on the weight of a showdown, each second stretching longer than the last. Harris stepped back just half an inch, as if testing whether Keanu would move forward to fill the gap. Keanu didn't. He simply stood, a quiet wall between Harris and Ronda, his presence drawing a line the cop would have to decide whether to cross again. The cook, still holding the plate he'd been about to serve, muttered under his breath, "Never seen him look like that before," though no one asked who he meant. All eyes stayed fixed on the two figures at the center of the storm. Harris adjusted his stance, the faint twitch in his jaw betraying irritation. "You think standing there makes you some kind of saint?" he scoffed. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Keanu didn't blink. "Neither do you." The words landed with the weight of a warning, calm but edged with a certainty that made Harris pause mid-breath. The customers could feel the temperature in the room shift. A woman near the door pulled her young daughter closer, sensing something dangerous in the air. The only sound was the faint hum of the diner's refrigerator. Renda leaned forward in her seat, her expression firm now. "You've had your fun," she said, voice steady. "It's over." Her tone wasn't pleading, it was a challenge, one that dared Harris to make his next move in front of everyone. Harris chuckled, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. He glanced toward the people watching, perhaps realizing for the first time how many witnesses he had. Some customers looked nervous, others openly disgusted. The teenager's phone was still up, recording every second. Keanu shifted his weight slightly, planting his feet in a way that signaled he wasn't going anywhere. "You've got a choice," he said. "Walk out of here now, or let everyone here see exactly who you are." His voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the diner. For a brief moment, Harris's face hardened, the kind of look that promised retaliation, but something in Keanu's demeanor, the complete lack of fear, the steady focus, seemed to pull the fight out of him in a way Harris didn't expect. He took half a step back, though his mouth still tried to keep the upper hand. "Not worth my time," he muttered, grabbing his order from the counter, as if that had been his only reason for being there all along. Keanu didn't move until Harris turned his back. Even then, his eyes tracked him to the door, making sure the space between Ronda and the cop remained unbroken. As Harris pushed past the crowd outside, a murmur of relief moved through the diner. People began to shift in their seats again, conversations picking back up, though the tension still clung to the air. Ronda exhaled slowly, sitting back against the booth. Her gaze met Keanu's, and for the first time since the incident began, a small, grateful smile touched her lips. "Thanks," she said simply. Keanu gave a short nod and returned to his seat without a word. But everyone watching knew it wasn't over. Not really. Harris wasn't the type to walk away without looking for a way to get even. Outside, the crowd dispersed slowly, but more than one person could be seen pulling out their phones, already posting the footage that was about to set the city buzzing. The low hum of uneasy murmurs filled the diner, but it was broken by a sudden, sharp voice from the back. "Leave her alone, man!" The shout sliced through the tension like a blade, drawing every pair of eyes toward its source. A middle-aged man with a worn baseball cap, standing with his fists clenched at his sides. The courage in his voice rippled through the room. Another voice joined in. "Yeah, we saw what you did. That's not okay." Then another, louder. "You think you can just walk in here and push people around?" Harris's head turned slowly toward the crowd, his jaw tightening. The mockery in his smirk was gone, replaced by a cold edge. "You all need to mind your business," he barked, his voice hard and clipped. "Sit down and finish your meals before you regret opening your mouths." The man in the baseball cap didn't sit down. He stepped forward, not much, but enough to show he wasn't intimidated. The air in the room thickened. Even the waitress behind the counter froze mid-step, her eyes darting between Harris and Keanu. Keanu shifted his stance, moving just enough to put himself between Harris and the others. His presence was quiet but commanding, his calm standing in sharp contrast to the cop's restless aggression. "You should go," Keanu said evenly, gesturing toward the door with a slight tilt of his head. Harris didn't move. His lips curled into something between a sneer and a laugh, as if the very suggestion offended him. "Go?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't take orders from some washed-up actor playing hero in a diner." The insult didn't register on Keanu's face. His expression stayed exactly the same, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, a flicker of warning, the kind that told Harris the line was wearing thin. Harris grabbed his bagged food order from the counter, but instead of heading to the door, he walked straight toward Keanu. The room seemed to shrink as he approached. When he reached him, he didn't sidestep. Instead, he slammed his shoulder deliberately into Keanu's, testing his balance, looking for any sign of retreat. Keanu didn't move, not an inch. His coffee cup on the table behind him didn't even tremble. The small crowd inside inhaled sharply. That single moment, Harris trying to assert dominance, Keanu standing like a wall, carried more weight than shouting ever could. Harris slowed to a stop just beyond Keanu, but the set of his jaw told everyone he wasn't done. The tension had climbed to its highest point. Something was going to give, and everyone in that diner could feel it hanging in the air. The seconds after the shoulder bump stretched unbearably long. Harris stood still, just far enough from Keanu to turn and lock eyes with him again. His grin returned, but it wasn't the casual kind. It was forced, hiding something uglier underneath. From the booth in the corner, Ronda leaned forward, her elbows on the table, watching every movement. She had seen countless stare-downs in the octagon, but this was different. No referee, no crowd, chanting. Just two men in a diner, the hum of the refrigerator in the back, and 100 unspoken threats hanging in the air. The man in the baseball cap muttered under his breath, "This guy's about to find out." Others nodded, their voices low but urgent. Harris finally broke the silence with a scoff. "You think standing there makes you tough? You think I care who you are?" His tone was laced with provocation, each word meant to dig deeper. Keanu didn't reply. His eyes remained locked on Harris, the stillness in his posture more intimidating than any flexed muscle. It was the kind of quiet that made people reconsider their next move, a quiet that didn't need to prove itself. "You've got 3 seconds to back up," Harris added, stepping closer again. His hand twitched at his side, not quite a fist, not quite relaxed. The crowd's energy shifted, a mix of fear and anticipation. Keanu's voice was almost too soft to hear, but it carried with precision. "You've already done enough." The words weren't a threat, but they landed heavier than a punch. The waitress by the register clutched her notepad, her knuckles white. She had seen Harris pull this kind of thing before, but never with someone who stood their ground this way. Outside, the crowd peering through the windows grew thicker. People pulled out their phones, pressing them to the glass, their breath fogging up the surface. They didn't know the full story yet, but they could sense it. The moment before a spark ignites. Harris chuckled, but it came out brittle. He glanced at the people filming, then back to Keanu. "All these folks think you're some saint," he said. "You're not fooling me." Keanu didn't break eye contact. His hands remained loose at his sides, but his presence radiated a steadiness that made Harris's voice falter for a fraction of a second. It was enough for the people watching to notice. From her booth, Ronda's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. She recognized it now. Keanu wasn't trying to win the moment. He was waiting for Harris to lose it. The cook in the back muttered to himself and turned off the grill, as if anticipating that no one would be eating until this ended. The air felt charged, like the diner itself was holding its breath. Harris shifted his stance, looking as though he might walk away, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. His pride had taken too many hits in the last few minutes, and he wasn't about to let it go quietly. He turned slightly toward the counter, reached for his food order, then paused. Without warning, he whipped back around and stepped in so close to Keanu that the toes of their shoes nearly touched. "You're in my space," Harris said, his breath heavy with the scent of coffee and frustration. Keanu didn't step back. "This isn't about space," he replied evenly. "It's about respect." The line cut through the room like a blade. No one spoke. The faint sound of a spoon clinking against a coffee cup somewhere in the back was the only noise. Harris's jaw flexed, his eyes darting to the door as though calculating whether leaving would look like retreat, but the weight of the eyes on him, from the customers, the waitress, and especially Keanu, held him in place. Ronda finally rose from her booth, slow and deliberate, her napkin sliding from her lap to the table. "You think you're intimidating," she said calmly, her voice carrying across the diner. "You're just loud." The comment hit harder than it seemed. A ripple of quiet laughter came from a few booths. Harris's neck flushed red. He swung his glare back to Keanu. "You bringing her into this now?" Keanu didn't take the bait. "She was already in it when you put your hands on her." For the first time, Harris's confidence faltered in a way he couldn't hide. The crowd could see it, the faint crack in his armor. Phones were still raised, capturing every second. Outside, more people had gathered, pressing closer to the windows. The sound of a siren in the far distance cut through the stale air, faint but growing louder. No one knew who had called, but the signal was clear. The moment was running out. Harris turned back to the counter, snatched his bag of food, and muttered something under his breath. He brushed past Keanu again, this time with less force, but his eyes lingered for a second too long, as if trying to salvage some measure of dominance. Keanu didn't follow him with words. He simply turned, walked back to his table, and sat down. The way he moved made it clear he hadn't backed down. He had simply chosen to end it before it crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Ronda remained standing for a moment, her eyes following Harris to the door. When it closed behind him, the room seemed to exhale all at once. The breaking point had come and gone, but everyone knew the story wasn't over. The moment Harris stepped outside, the atmosphere inside the diner remained taut, like a rope pulled to its limit. The customers still didn't know if the confrontation was truly over. Keanu sat in his booth for a long second, then leaned slightly toward the counter. "May I borrow your landline?" he asked the waitress, his voice calm but leaving no room for refusal. The young woman behind the counter blinked, startled by the unexpected request. She had been frozen during the whole exchange, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the coffee pot. Yes, it's right here," she stammered, sliding the handset toward him. Keanu stood, took the phone in his hand, and dialed without hesitation. The sound of each button pressing echoed unnaturally loud in the diner. He didn't reach for his cell. This was intentional. He wanted every person in the room, and anyone watching from the street, to see exactly what he was doing. When the line connected, his tone remained steady, almost conversational. "Yes." "Internal affairs, please. This is Keanu Reeves. I'm at Mel's Diner on 3rd Street. There's been an incident involving Detective Harris. He physically assaulted a woman in public, unprovoked." The shift in the room was immediate. Conversations stopped. A man in the corner, halfway through his sandwich, lowered it back to his plate and stared. Even the cook in the back peeked out from the kitchen door. Keanu continued, giving a precise, measured account. He described the shove, the verbal taunts, the intimidation toward bystanders. He even mentioned the phones recording the whole thing. His words carried no exaggeration, no anger, just an unshakable clarity that made the reality impossible to deny. Near the entrance, a couple of people who had been filming gave each other quick nods. This wasn't just a celebrity making a scene. This was someone who knew exactly how to make it count. Outside, Harris's tall frame was visible through the glass. He was leaning against the hood of his car, unwrapping his food. When his eyes drifted back toward the counter, and he saw Keanu holding the phone, speaking with deliberate calm, something in his posture changed. The easy arrogance in his stance seemed to stiffen. His shoulders squared, and his chewing slowed to a halt. Inside, Ronda had remained silent since Harris left, but now a small, unmistakable smirk curved at the corner of her lips. She recognized the move for what it was. Not a strike with fists, but a strike where it mattered most. Keanu listened for a moment, then spoke again. "Yes, I'm willing to give a formal statement, and there are at least 15 witnesses here who can corroborate it. Some have video." He glanced briefly at the teenager in the back, who was still clutching his phone, recording even now. When he finally placed the handset back on the counter, the silence held for a beat. Then, quietly, someone near the window whispered. He just called internal affairs, and the whisper spread like a wave. The murmur in the diner began to swell, a mixture of awe and anticipation. For years, people in the neighborhood had seen Harris act above the law, but few had dared to stand in his way. Now, here was Keanu Reeves, not throwing punches, not making a scene, but dismantling the cop's shield of untouchability with a single phone call. The waitress gave Keanu a nervous glance, as if trying to gauge whether she should be afraid or relieved. Are they sending someone?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Keanu replied with a calm nod. "They'll be here soon." That assurance seemed to ripple outward, loosening the fear that had gripped the room. A man at the counter muttered, About time someone did something. And the woman next to him agreed, her voice tight but approving. Through the large front window, Harris noticed the change. The stares from inside weren't fearful anymore. They were sharp, challenging, almost defiant. He straightened, tossing his half-eaten sandwich into the paper bag and crumpling it in his hand. He walked back toward the door, his expression darkening, but something in his eyes betrayed uncertainty. This wasn't going the way he had planned. As the bell over the door jingled with his return, the entire diner seemed to brace itself. Chairs shifted, feet moved subtly to make space, and phones quietly angled for a better view. Harris looked directly at Keanu, his jaw tight. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice low but carrying enough weight to reach the far tables. "Making sure someone in authority knows what happened here," Keanu answered evenly, not rising from his seat. Harris's gaze darted to Ronda, who now sat upright, her eyes locked on him without a flicker of fear. Then his eyes went to the counter, where the waitress stood frozen, and finally to the teenager holding his phone steady. The realization hit him. This wasn't just about Keanu anymore. The whole room had turned into witnesses. "You're making a mistake," Harris growled, stepping closer. "Maybe," Keanu replied, his tone still calm. "Or maybe I'm just making sure you understand that you don't get to do that to people without consequences." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Harris's smirk from earlier was gone, replaced by a tight, almost forced expression. The power he usually wielded so easily seemed to be slipping away in plain sight. From a table near the back, someone clapped. Just once, but it was enough to break the tension. A few others followed, the sound small but unmistakable. The mood in the diner had shifted entirely. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to show whose side they were on. The sound of that scattered applause seemed to strike Harris harder than any punch could. He turned toward the clapping with a glare sharp enough to cut, but the diner patrons didn't look away. They weren't cowed anymore. They had seen the shift, felt the tide turn, and they weren't giving it back. Keanu stayed seated, one hand loosely resting on the counter, the other cupping his coffee mug. His posture was relaxed, but every line of his body radiated quiet readiness. Harris couldn't decide if it was arrogance or something far more dangerous, the kind of control that came from knowing you didn't have to raise your voice to be heard. The waitress leaned toward Keanu, whispering, "They said they're sending a senior officer, should be here in minutes." Keanu gave a small nod. "Thank you." Harris scoffed, pacing toward the front door, his boots thudding on the old linoleum. "You think I'm going to stand here and wait for some pencil pusher from downtown to tell me how to do my job?" he sneered, turning back toward Keanu. "You already told us how you do your job," Keanu replied, voice steady. "And now, you're going to have to answer for it." The room stilled again. Rhonda's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile, the kind you give when you realize someone just played the winning move without even standing from the table. Outside, more people were gathering. Passers-by who didn't know exactly what was happening could sense the tension from the sidewalk. Some held up their phones, trying to capture the scene through the glass. The hum of conversation inside mixed with the muffled sounds of the street, creating a strange, expectant quiet. Harris's eyes flickered to the growing crowd outside, then back to Keanu. He knew that whatever happened next would be remembered, recorded, shared. The certainty of that fact pressed against him like a weight. A deep rumble of an approaching engine broke the silence. Then the distant wail of a police siren cut through the air. The sound grew louder with each passing second, until the reflection of flashing lights painted the diner windows red and blue. Harris's jaw worked as if he was grinding his teeth, but he stayed rooted to the spot. Keanu took a slow sip of his coffee and set the mug down, his gaze never leaving Harris. "Looks like your ride's here," he said softly, but the words carried like a final bell before a match. The siren stopped. The lights kept flashing. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. The diner's front door was about to open, and everyone inside knew that whatever happened next would decide the ending to this confrontation. The front door swung open, letting in a rush of warm afternoon air and the distinct scent of city asphalt. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their eyes immediately scanning the room. The taller of the two, a broad-shouldered man with a steady gaze, spoke first. "Detective Harris," he said in a neutral tone that carried an edge of formality, "we need to have a word." Harris straightened his stance, squaring his shoulders like a soldier called to attention. "What's this about?" he asked, feigning ignorance. His voice was calm, but his eyes darted briefly toward Keanu, then to Ronda, then back to the officers. The second officer, a woman with a notepad already in hand, replied, "We received a direct call to internal affairs about an incident here." She glanced toward the counter, her gaze settling on Keanu. "You're the caller?" Keanu gave a single nod. "That's right." Before Harris could insert himself into the conversation, the teenager from the corner stood up, phone in hand. His fingers moved quickly over the screen before he held it out toward the officers. "I got the whole thing," the boy said, his voice a mix of nerves and righteous certainty. The woman took the phone carefully, her brow furrowing as she hit play. The diner was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the old ceiling fan. In the video, Harris's voice came through clearly, along with the unmistakable moment his hand shoved Rhonda's face into her plate. The grainy footage showed every detail: her startled expression, the sudden movement, and the murmurs of the surrounding customers. The taller officer's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice stayed professional. "Detective, step over here." Harris let out a short, humorless laugh. "Come on, this is a misunderstanding. She was mouthing off. I was trying to—" "You assaulted her," one of the regulars interrupted from a booth. "We all saw it." The second officer, still holding the teenager's phone, didn't look up as she said, "Multiple witnesses confirm the incident." She replayed the clip briefly, then lowered the device. "This isn't going away with a few words." Keanu hadn't moved closer, but his presence was unmistakable. He stood beside Ronda now, his body angled slightly toward her, as if shielding her from further harm. He didn't speak, didn't smirk, didn't react to Harris's attempts at deflection. He was simply there, solid, steady, and unshakable. Randa noticed the subtle way he kept his stance between her and Harris. It wasn't grandstanding. It was protection without a single unnecessary motion. The taller officer gestured toward a table near the window. "Let's step over here, detective." His tone was firm now, leaving little room for argument. Harris hesitated, then moved slowly, his boots scraping against the worn linoleum floor. As he walked past, he gave Keanu a glare that carried both anger and humiliation. Keanu didn't return it. His eyes stayed calm, fixed on nothing in particular. It was as if Harris's reaction didn't warrant even a second of his energy. The officer began asking questions, jotting notes quickly. "Were you aware the individual you confronted is a public figure?" he asked. Harris shrugged. "Doesn't matter to me who she is." "Then why the physical contact?" the officer pressed. Harris leaned back in the chair, arms crossed. "She was being disrespectful. I was putting her in her place. That's all." The woman officer, still holding the teenager's phone, spoke up. "Detective, do you hear yourself? You're on video committing assault in a public setting, in uniform, with witnesses. This isn't something that disappears because you call it discipline." Around them, customers murmured in agreement. A man in a trucker cap spoke loudly from the counter. "She didn't do a thing to deserve that, and you sure as hell don't get to treat people like that just because you wear a badge." Renda kept quiet, her expression unreadable, but Keanu could sense the tension in her posture. She wasn't afraid. That wasn't her nature. But she was calculating, weighing what this moment might mean for her and for the cop who had underestimated her. Harris tried one last pivot. "This is all being blown out of proportion. I've served this city for 15 years. My record? Your record will be part of the investigation, the taller officer interrupted. The weight of the word investigation seemed to land heavier than anything else. Harris's jaw clenched, but his posture sagged slightly. Keanu's eyes shifted briefly to the crowd. Some people were holding their phones low, still recording. Others simply watched, their expressions a mixture of vindication and disbelief that this was actually happening. The second officer handed the teenager's phone back. "Thank you for coming forward. We'll need your contact information before you leave." The boy nodded eagerly, clearly aware that his video had just changed the course of the afternoon. The taller officer turned back to Harris. "Detective, for now, you're relieved of duty pending review. You need to surrender your badge and service weapon before leaving this premises." The diner went dead quiet. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than usual. Harris's face flushed, a deep shade of red, his hand twitching at his side before he slowly reached into his jacket. He placed the badge on the table with a metallic clink, followed by the heavy thud of his sidearm. The woman officer stepped forward, securing the weapon. "We'll escort you out," she said simply. Her voice wasn't gloating, it was procedural, almost gentle, but the humiliation was no less sharp. Harris stood, straightening his jacket as if trying to reclaim some measure of dignity. His eyes darted to Keanu, lingering for a beat longer this time. It wasn't a glare anymore, more like reluctant acknowledgement. Keanu held his gaze briefly, then looked away, signaling without words that the moment was over. Ronda finally exhaled, her shoulders loosening. The weight of the room shifted. The atmosphere, once suffocating with tension, began to ease. The officers guided Harris toward the door. As they stepped outside, the small crowd gathered beyond the glass erupted in murmurs. Some people raised their phones higher to capture the moment. Others simply shook their heads, astonished. Inside, the diner felt oddly still, as if everyone was processing what they had just witnessed. A waitress quietly refilled Keanu's coffee, her hand steady now. "On the house," she said softly. Randall glanced at him. "You didn't have to do that?" Keanu took a sip before answering. "Sometimes you do what's right, even if you don't have to." She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For someone used to fighting her own battles, it meant something to have someone step in without trying to take over her story. At the corner table, the teenager grinned as he typed rapidly on his phone. It was clear the footage was already making its way across social media. Within minutes, the scene that had unfolded here would no longer be confined to 4 diner walls. Keanu set his cup down again, his attention still on the door where Harris had exited. He wasn't thinking about the viral videos or the headlines that might come. He was thinking about the quiet victory of the moment. That, for once, someone who thought they were untouchable had been reminded they weren't. Outside the diner, Harris stood with his arms crossed, his jaw locked tight as the 2 uniformed officers began their questioning. The taller one kept his tone measured, but his words cut with quiet authority. "Detective Harris, we've had multiple witness accounts that you assaulted a civilian. I need you to explain your version of events." Harris shifted his weight, glancing toward the crowd behind the police tape that had gone up around the entrance. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice already elevated. "It was a misunderstanding. She was mouthing off, I was just..." "Just what?" the female officer interrupted, pen poised over her notepad. "Pushing her face into her meal? Because that's what the statements say." "I didn't..." Harris began, but his words faltered as the teenager from inside stepped forward, holding up his phone. "It's all on video," the boy said, his tone steady but his eyes wide with the thrill of telling the truth to a man who once seemed untouchable. The officer took the phone, watching the short clip in silence before passing it to her partner. Harris's lips thinned as his shoulders squared, the defensiveness in his stance unmistakable. Keanu stepped through the door just then, his presence instantly quieting the murmurs from the crowd. He didn't approach Harris directly, instead stopping near the officers. "I think you've got enough to see this wasn't about keeping the peace," he said calmly. "This was about control, and it crossed a line." Harris shot him a look sharp enough to cut, but Keanu didn't flinch. He simply stood, hands in his pockets, his tone even and without mockery. Violence wasn't necessary. Not then. Not ever. The taller officer looked from Keanu to the other witnesses clustered near the door. "All right, we're going to take official statements from everyone here. If you saw or heard anything relevant, line up by the window. We'll talk to you one at a time." A few customers stepped forward immediately, an older woman clutching her purse, a man in work boots still holding his coffee mug, and the waitress who had nearly dropped a plate when the altercation began. One by one, they began recounting exactly what they had seen, each account adding weight to the case against Harris. With each statement, Harris's scowl deepened. He muttered under his breath, but the officers ignored him, their focus on compiling the truth piece by piece. The female officer typed quickly into her tablet, her brow furrowed as she cross-referenced the statements. "We're getting the same version from every witness," she said to her partner in a low voice, though it was loud enough for Harris to hear. Harris stepped forward, voice rising again. "They're exaggerating. You think some viral clip tells the whole story? You know how these things get twisted." The taller officer didn't react to his tone. "Detective, I'm going to need you to calm down. This isn't the time to get defensive, it's the time to be transparent." Keanu remained near the entrance, leaning slightly against the wall, but keeping his gaze on the exchange. He only spoke when the officers asked for clarification. "He was warned," Keanu said evenly, "twice. He chose to ignore it." Harris let out a short, bitter laugh. "And you think you're the moral authority here?" He looked around at the gathered crowd, as if trying to find a single person who would side with him. None did. The silence was telling. Another customer, a middle-aged truck driver with grease still on his hands, stepped forward. "I don't know who you think you are, but you don't treat people like that, badge or no badge." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen his share of unfair fights. The teenager's video was played again for the officers, this time with the sound turned up. The sickening scrape of the chair legs against the floor, the gasps from nearby tables, and Ronda's muffled sound of shock filled the air. Randa stood a few steps away, arms folded, her face composed, but her eyes sharp. She wasn't gloating either. She didn't need to. The truth was speaking for itself. The female officer finally holstered her tablet. "We're calling this in to internal affairs from the scene," she announced. "Given the number of witnesses, the video evidence, and your conduct here, we have enough to justify temporary suspension, pending investigation." Harris's face flushed a deep red, his jaw working as if he wanted to argue further, but the look in the officer's eyes told him it would only dig him deeper. Keanu didn't smile, didn't show satisfaction. He simply shifted his stance, staying close enough to Ronda that she knew she wasn't standing alone. The taller officer took a step back, adjusting his radio as he spoke into it. "Control, be advised. Detective Harris is being relieved of duty effective immediately pending further review." The words hung in the air, final and unquestionable. Gasps rippled through the diner. Some customers exchanged stunned glances, while others allowed small smiles of relief to creep across their faces. The weight of Harris's authority had just been lifted, and the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Harris tried one last time to salvage his pride. "This is ridiculous. I've put my life on the line for this town, and this is how you treat me? Over a misunderstanding?" His voice cracked under the strain, revealing more desperation than conviction. The female officer met his gaze squarely. "You don't get to hide behind your service record when your actions betray the badge. We hold ourselves to a higher standard. Or at least we should." A slow, deliberate round of applause began at the back of the diner. The truck driver was the first to clap, his calloused palms echoing against the walls. Then the teenager joined in, still clutching his phone. Within seconds, the sound swelled into a wave of approval, not mocking, but affirming that decency had prevailed. Rhonda stood a little taller. She didn't bow her head or shrink back anymore. She looked at Keanu, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. No words exchanged, but gratitude and acknowledgement passed between them. Harris stood, rigid, his fists clenched, but he said nothing further. The officers escorted him toward the door, their presence ensuring no last-minute outburst would derail the situation. The diner's entrance swung open, letting in the cool air from outside, and Harris disappeared into it. As the door shut behind him, the noise in the room softened again. Conversations resumed, but now they carried a different tone. Lighter, freer. A few people approached Rhonda to ask if she was all right. She assured them she was, though her voice still carried the faint tremor of adrenaline. Keanu remained near the counter, not basking in any spotlight, simply making sure the moment had truly settled. The officers took one last set of notes, exchanged a few quiet words with him, and then left. In the aftermath, the diner didn't feel like the same place. The tension had broken, replaced by an unspoken understanding among those who'd been there, that they'd witnessed not just a confrontation, but a reminder that dignity matters, no matter who you are. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet street outside the diner. The crowd that had gathered earlier was dispersing, some still glancing over their shoulders as they walked away. Rhonda stood near the curb, her arms crossed loosely, a faint breeze lifting strands of hair from her face. Keanu stepped out, holding the door for an elderly woman before making his way toward her. There was no fanfare in his movements, just the same quiet presence that had defined every moment since he'd walked in. "Thank you," Rhonda said softly, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of relief. "Not for saving me. I could have handled him if I wanted to. But for making sure I didn't have to." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression one of respect. "I know you could have," he replied. "But you made the choice not to let it turn into something worse." Rhonda looked down for a moment, the weight of the day settling on her. "People think restraint is weakness, but I've learned that sometimes walking away from a fight takes more strength than winning it." She met his eyes again, and there was a glint of shared understanding. Keanu nodded slowly. "I've been there," he said. "Fighting isn't always about fists. Sometimes it's about control, about choosing the moment, or choosing not to have one at all." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of traffic in the distance filling the space between their words. "I knew what Harris was doing," Rhonda continued. "It wasn't about me. It was about him needing to feel like he had the upper hand. If I'd swung back, it would have given him exactly what he wanted, a reason to take it further, to put it on me." Keanu's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger at her words, but in recognition of the truth in them. "You saw the bigger picture," he said. "That's rare." Rhonda smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Guess that's something we have in common." Keanu returned the smile, though his eyes stayed serious. Different arenas, same fight. The air between them felt like the meeting point of two warriors who understood the costs of battle. One who had walked away from countless physical confrontations, and another who had lived enough to know that some battles are won without throwing a single punch. The street lamps flickered on above them, spilling warm light over the cracked pavement. Rhonda shifted her stance, her gaze sweeping over the diner's windows, where the last of the evening regulars were finishing their meals. "You know," she said, "when you first stood up, I thought you were just another bystander trying to play hero. Happens all the time, someone stepping in without knowing what they're getting into." She paused, then added with a smirk, "But you weren't just standing up for me. You were standing up for the moment." Keanu's brow furrowed slightly. "The moment?" "Yeah," she said. "Those moments when everyone else looks away, thinking it's not their problem. That's when it matters most to have someone choose to step forward." Her words hung in the air, their weight carried by lived experience. Keanu didn't need to tell her he understood. His silence and the steady way he looked at her were answer enough. I wasn't sure how far he was going to push it, Keanu admitted, but I could see he was counting on no one calling him out. People like that, they get used to walking through life unchecked. Ronda gave a short laugh, not from humor but from recognition. You're right, and the worst part is, they feed off the silence of the people around them. The breeze picked up again, carrying the faint scent of coffee and grilled food from the diner. It reminded them both of the tense minutes inside, the stillness that had spread through the room when confrontation was brewing. I've had my fair share of fights, Ronda continued, her voice softening, but they were always in the ring. Out here, it's different. Out here, you can't just trade blows until someone's down. Out here, it's about knowing what's worth fighting for. Keanu glanced toward the darkening horizon. And today was worth it. Ronda's expression shifted into something between gratitude and relief. It was. And I'm glad it was you. You didn't come in swinging, you came in steady. That's what rattled him more than anything. Keanu allowed himself the faintest smile. Sometimes stillness is louder than shouting. For a moment, the noise of the city seemed far away. It was just the two of them, standing in the fading light, bonded by an unspoken truth. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands still and refuses to move. Ronda shifted her weight and glanced toward the corner of the street where the two patrol cars had been parked earlier. The spot was empty now, but the memory of flashing lights still lingered. You know, she said quietly, I've had plenty of people tell me to pick my battles. Most of the time, I do. But today, I was ready to let it go. Not because I was scared, but because I knew how much it would cost me to win the wrong way. Keanu studied her face, catching the flicker of resolve behind her eyes. There's a kind of strength in that, he said. Not every fight is worth throwing a punch for. Ronda let out a slow breath. You'd be surprised how many people don't understand that. In the ring, you have rules. A referee, a crowd that knows exactly what they came to see. Out here, it's chaos. And chaos, well, it doesn't care who's right or wrong. The sound of a bus rumbling past filled the pause between them. Its headlights washed over their faces, then faded as it turned down another street. I guess what I'm saying, Ronda continued, is that if you hadn't stepped in, I would have walked away. But part of me would have hated myself for it. You gave me a way to stand my ground without losing control. Keanu's gaze softened. Maybe we both needed that moment for different reasons. She tilted her head. What reason did you need it for? Keanu hesitated, then answered, to remind myself that silence isn't always the safer choice. It's easy to think that staying out of it means staying peaceful, but sometimes peace comes from stopping something before it grows. The truth in his words settled between them like a quiet agreement. They didn't need to exchange thanks again. They had already shared something more enduring than gratitude, an understanding of when to step in and when to hold back. Finally, Ronda straightened, her shoulders squared. Well, I should let you go, but if we ever cross paths again, I owe you a coffee. Black, right? Keanu chuckled softly. Black. They shared one last nod before parting ways, each walking in opposite directions, yet carrying the same sense of resolve. For all the tension and ugliness of the afternoon, something good had come of it. The kind of good that doesn't make headlines but changes people all the same. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the little diner incident had become something much bigger. A teenager's shaky phone footage, captured from the corner booth, had already been posted to multiple platforms. Within minutes, it was being shared, reposted, and stitched into reactions by influencers across the world. The video opened with a still frame of Harris leaning toward Ronda, his face twisted in aggression, before showing Keanu stepping in with a calm, steady presence. There were no flashy movements, no dramatic shouts, just quiet, measured words and an unshakable stance. That restraint became the talking point almost instantly. Hashtags began to spread: Stand with Ronda, Keanu the Peacemaker, and the one that dominated by nightfall, Dignity Wins. People who didn't follow mixed martial arts recognized Ronda's name. People who weren't movie buffs recognized Keanu's. But it wasn't about fame. It was about the moment captured between them, a silent alliance against unnecessary cruelty. News outlets moved quickly. Headlines rolled out in bold, capital letters. Keanu Reeves defends Ronda Rousey from rogue cop without throwing a punch. Commentators on evening talk shows praised the approach, noting that in an age where confrontation often meant escalation, the scene offered a different kind of power. Clips of the video were slowed down, paused, and analyzed. The way Keanu stepped forward without raising his hands, the way Ronda stood tall but didn't lash back. The look on Harris's face as his confidence wavered under public scrutiny. Every frame was dissected as if it were a scene from a film. Except this was real. By night, the story had transcended borders. Social media feeds in Europe, South America, and Asia carried the same headlines, translated into dozens of languages. Posts poured in from people who had never set foot in that diner, each expressing the same sentiment, that dignity and self-control could be more powerful than force. Outside Keanu's home, a small cluster of reporters had already gathered, hoping for a statement. Ronda's phone lit up with interview requests from outlets she had never even heard of, but both of them stayed quiet for now, letting the moment breathe. The world had already made up its mind about what they had witnessed. Through the night, the comment sections became a stream of unified outrage against Harris and overwhelming support for Ronda and Keanu. People shared their own experiences of being mistreated by those in positions of power, each story adding fuel to the conversation. Verified accounts began weighing in. Former athletes praised Ronda's discipline in holding back. Actors and directors lauded Keanu's refusal to let ego dictate his actions. Even a few retired law enforcement officers publicly supported the decision to call internal affairs rather than engage physically. Their words carried weight, reinforcing that strength wasn't just measured by the ability to strike, but by the ability to choose not to. Clips from the video appeared in morning news promos and late-night comedy monologues alike. Memes started to circulate. Keanu standing calmly with captions about boss-level patience and the art of the silent win. Yet even the humorous posts carried respect. This wasn't mockery. It was admiration wrapped in internet language. For Ronda, the shift was personal. Strangers who had never followed her fighting career were now leaving messages of gratitude on her social media pages, thanking her for handling the situation with grace. Many said they had expected her to fight back and were stunned, in the best way, that she chose restraint. Keanu's inbox, managed by his small team, began overflowing with messages from advocacy groups, charities, and community leaders who saw an opportunity to use this moment to highlight better conflict resolution. Several suggested public forums, interviews, or even a joint statement from Keanu and Ronda about peaceful intervention. But for the two of them, the world's noise was distant compared to the quiet sense of accomplishment they felt. They hadn't set out to create a viral moment. They had just reacted as they believed was right. And yet, the reaction proved that people were hungry for examples of calm in the face of arrogance. By early morning, the story had been picked up by global news agencies. The clip had crossed 20 million views across platforms, and the hashtags were still climbing. Whether they liked it or not, Keanu and Ronda had become symbols overnight, not just for standing up against abuse, but for doing it without adding to the harm. As the sun rose over Los Angeles, the diner's quiet corner booth, once just another seat in a modest eatery, became a landmark in online culture. People posted pictures outside, tagging themselves with captions about courage and composure. It wasn't about celebrity worship. It was about the reminder that anyone, famous or not, could stand up for someone else without making the situation worse. Keanu's face, mid-stare at Harris, became the image attached to think pieces about measured masculinity and the new definition of strength. Writers noted how his calm was in direct contrast to the bluster often glorified in public confrontations. Ronda's smirk in the background became equally symbolic, not of smugness, but of knowing when you've already won without throwing a single punch. Talk shows invited body language experts to analyze the clip frame by frame. They pointed out how Keanu's stance was relaxed yet immovable, how he never broke eye contact, and how Ronda's posture shifted from guarded to confident once she realized she was no longer alone in the moment. The discussion went beyond gossip. It was about power dynamics, respect, and the quiet authority of people who didn't need to shout to be heard. Hashtags evolved into movements. Stand with Grace and Calm is Power began trending alongside the original tags. Community organizations started using the clip in workshops about de-escalation and non-violent resistance. It was the kind of real-world impact neither Keanu nor Ronda had anticipated. Late in the day, the diner owner posted a simple message on social media. "We serve coffee. We don't serve disrespect. Thank you to everyone who's reminded us what dignity looks like." The post went viral too, drawing in support for the small business and further cementing the moment as something bigger than a single altercation. By nightfall, the clip had passed 50 million views. News anchors described it as an incredible story of modern-day heroism, noting that it wasn't about fists or fame, but about human decency. And somewhere far from the glare of the cameras, Keanu and Ronda both went about their evenings quietly. They didn't need to join the noise. They had lived the moment. The world could talk all it wanted. The two of them already knew what mattered, and that was enough. By the next morning, the story had spread to every corner of the media landscape. Morning shows, late-night hosts, news podcasts, and even political commentators were weighing in on the diner incident. Television crews parked outside the small restaurant, their satellite vans taking up most of the block. Producers scrambled to secure exclusive interviews, some even offering large donations to Keanu's favorite charities if he would agree to appear on camera. But Keanu was not interested in turning the moment into a publicity circuit. When asked directly by a respected journalist if he would share his side, he responded simply, "The video already tells the story. It's not about me." That was the line he repeated to every other outlet that called, emailed, or sent representatives to his home. To him, the focus should be on what happened and how accountability would follow, not on inflating his own reputation. Ronda, however, understood the importance of speaking up, especially for people who might not have her platform or confidence. She agreed to a brief interview with a sports network she trusted. Her statement was short but carried weight. Keanu showed what integrity looks like. He didn't have to get loud or violent to stand up for what's right. That's real strength. The clip of her comment quickly joined the viral rotation online, layered over the original diner footage. People saw the sincerity in her eyes, the gratitude behind her words, and it resonated. She didn't embellish, didn't make herself the hero, and didn't use the moment to promote a fight or a film. It was simply respect, plainly spoken. Not everyone reacted with grace. The local police union released a strongly worded statement defending Harris, calling the situation a misunderstanding exaggerated by social media. They questioned the reliability of witnesses and suggested the video lacked full context. But the problem with their argument was that the context was already clear in the uncut, uninterrupted recording that had been viewed by tens of millions. There was no missing footage, no camera trick, just a slow, steady sequence of disrespect, followed by an equally steady response from Keanu. If anything, the union's statement only fueled public backlash. People began posting side-by-side comparisons of the statement and the raw footage, pointing out the discrepancies and labeling it an attempt to rewrite reality. The harder the union pushed, the more the video was shared. Each repost adding another layer of scrutiny. Meanwhile, Ronda found herself fielding calls from friends, former training partners, and even rivals in the MMA world. Some told her they were proud of how she handled herself. Others admitted they probably wouldn't have been able to show the same restraint. The incident had struck a nerve within the fighting community, where the ability to physically dominate often overshadowed the value of self-restraint. Keanu stayed mostly out of the spotlight, but he did take one quiet step that no one knew about until much later. He reached out privately to a nonprofit that specialized in supporting victims of misconduct by law enforcement, offering a sizable donation in Harris's jurisdiction. There were no press releases, no photo ops, just a wire transfer and a handwritten note thanking them for the work they did. In the broader conversation online, people began connecting the incident to larger issues about power and abuse of authority. Hashtags that had started with the diner's name and location evolved into broader movements, attracting attention from activists and community leaders. Keanu's image was often used in memes and graphics, not as an action star, but as a symbol of calm resistance. Ronda's poised, unshaken expression from the moment Harris realized he was in trouble became a still image shared thousands of times, captioned with words like dignity, strength, and unbreakable. Not all media coverage was fair. A handful of opinion pieces tried to frame the incident as a publicity stunt, speculating that Keanu and Ronda might have staged the confrontation. These articles were quickly drowned out by the overwhelming tide of first-hand witness accounts, each confirming the authenticity of what happened. The teenager who had filmed the original video was even interviewed by a major news network, explaining that he hadn't expected the clip to go viral. He just thought it was important to document what he saw. Through it all, Keanu maintained his deliberate silence in the press. Friends close to him told reporters that he believed the more he talked about the event, the more it risked becoming a celebrity story rather than a lesson in accountability. That, more than anything, kept his reputation intact. By refusing to make himself the center, he allowed the truth of the footage to speak louder than any statement ever could. The cop union statement, released late in the evening, attempted to shift the narrative. It spoke vaguely about misunderstandings in high-pressure environments and warned against what it called trial by social media. The wording was careful, but it was clear they were trying to shield Harris from the worst of the backlash. However, within minutes, the comment sections of their official pages were flooded with responses. People were linking the viral video directly, pointing out the lack of any visible threat from Ronda, and questioning why a man with a badge felt entitled to act as he did. Several prominent figures in sports and entertainment chimed in, some sharing personal stories of similar encounters. A retired police chief even went on record saying that Harris's behavior was a textbook example of what erodes public trust. This unexpected endorsement from within law enforcement carried weight, further undercutting the union's defense. Ronda, for her part, kept her statement short and purposeful. She thanked those who had supported her, expressed gratitude to the diner staff and the witnesses, and ended with a pointed line, "Strength isn't just about how hard you can hit, it's about knowing when not to." The quote spread quickly, becoming almost as iconic as the video itself. In the days following, the public's attention began to split between calls for Harris's permanent dismissal and a fascination with the unlikely pairing of Ronda and Keanu in such a tense public moment. Fan art began appearing online, sketches, digital paintings, even stylized movie poster-style graphics, imagining the scene as part of an action film. Neither Keanu nor Ronda engaged with these directly, but the lighthearted creativity was a stark contrast to the seriousness of the initial event. Behind the scenes, sources confirmed that Internal Affairs had launched a full investigation into Harris's conduct. This meant interviews, a review of his prior record, and a thorough examination of the viral footage, frame by frame. For the first time in years, Harris was on the defensive, and it wasn't because of his work in the field. It was because the public had been watching, and they refused to look away. Through all of it, Keanu remained as he had been in that diner, steady, quiet, and unshaken. The media could speculate, the union could deflect, but the truth had been captured in a few raw minutes of unfiltered reality. And that truth was not going away. The press conference was held in a modest municipal building, far from the glossy backdrop of a police headquarters. The air in the room was heavy with expectation, a mix of reporters, local residents, and a handful of uniformed officers in attendance. Cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights blinking steadily. At the front of the room stood a simple podium with a microphone, flanked by two flags, one of the United States and one of the state. When Harris entered, there was a noticeable hush. Gone was the swagger that had fueled his presence in the diner that day. His uniform looked freshly pressed, but his shoulders sagged in a way that suggested more than just physical fatigue. He took a moment to adjust the microphone, his eyes scanning the room but carefully avoiding direct contact with either Keanu or Ronda, who were seated in the front row. "I want to start by saying that I was wrong," he began, his voice lower and slower than usual. "What happened in that diner should never have happened. My actions toward Ms. Rousey were out of line, disrespectful, and unbecoming of someone in my position. And my response to Mr. Reeves? It was uncalled for." The room remained silent, but the scribble of pens and the click of camera shutters filled the pauses. Harris swallowed, visibly uneasy under the gaze of so many witnesses. "I let my frustration, my ego, and my poor judgment override the duty I have to treat every person with respect. I failed in that duty. For that, I am deeply sorry." He then turned toward Keanu and Ronda, holding their eyes for the first time since stepping to the podium. "Mr. Reeves, Miss Rousey, you showed more restraint and dignity in that moment than I did in my entire handling of the situation. You had every right to respond with anger, but you didn't. You chose a better path. I hope you can accept my apology." Keanu stood slowly, walking toward the podium with measured steps. The room leaned forward as the two men faced each other, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Keanu extended his hand without hesitation. Harris accepted it, the handshake firm but not aggressive, a silent exchange of acknowledgement. Keanu held Harris's gaze as he spoke, his tone calm yet carrying a weight that made the words sink into the room. "I accept your apology," he said, "but I also believe respect should never be optional. It's not a courtesy you offer only when you feel like it. It's the foundation of trust. In any profession, but especially in one where people's safety is in your hands." His words weren't sharp, but they cut through the space with precision. There was no triumph in his voice, no gloating, only a steady conviction that made every listener pause. Harris nodded, the tension in his jaw loosening as if the words had landed where they needed to. Ronda stood next, her presence commanding in a way that required no raised voice. She approached the podium, folding her arms loosely as she looked Harris in the eye. "Forgiveness doesn't erase accountability," she said. "You can own your mistake, and I can accept your apology, but that doesn't mean we forget what happened. It means you work every day to make sure it never happens again. To anyone." Harris shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't flinch away from her words. "I understand," he replied quietly. Ronda's expression softened just slightly. "Good, because the next time you're wearing that badge, you'll be the one deciding if someone else walks away with dignity or walks away broken. You have the power to make that choice. Use it the right way." The exchange between them wasn't filled with theatrics, but it had a gravity that made the reporters hold their breaths before typing. The room was so still that even the faint hum of the lights above seemed loud. Keanu and Ronda returned to their seats side by side, a silent but unified front. Harris stepped back from the podium, looking smaller than when he had arrived, but perhaps a little lighter. It wasn't the absolution of his career or reputation, those battles would play out over time, but it was a first step, one that required him to face the people he had wronged without hiding behind rank or excuses. The moderator cleared his throat and gestured for the next speaker, but no one missed the fact that the defining moment had already happened. As the press conference wound down, the atmosphere remained heavy but noticeably shifted. The initial tension that had hung in the air like a storm cloud had thinned, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement that something rare had just taken place. A moment where conflict ended not in bitterness, but in a fragile, hard-earned truce. When the cameras clicked off and the microphones were lowered, Harris stepped down from the stage and approached Keanu and Ronda directly. Without the glare of the media lights, his voice was almost tentative. "I meant what I said. I was out of line. I'm working with internal affairs now, and I'm getting help. For my temper, for everything." Keanu gave a single nod, his eyes steady but not cold. "Then take it seriously. Because one day, the choice you make in a split second will define you. It already has once. Make sure the next time is different." Ronda extended her hand again, this time with a firmness that spoke of respect. Harris shook it, his grip less defensive than before. "Thank you," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried more sincerity than anything he'd said in weeks. The three stood there for a brief moment in an unspoken understanding. They were not friends, and they might never be, but they were human beings who had shared a moment that tested all of them in different ways. Outside the building, a crowd had gathered, many of them holding signs or phones ready to record. When Keanu and Ronda stepped into the sunlight, there was no roar of victory or chants of triumph. Instead, there was applause, slow, measured, and filled with a sense of respect rather than spectacle. Keanu raised a hand in acknowledgement but didn't linger. He wasn't there for the headlines, and neither was Ronda. They walked together through the crowd, past the cameras and questions, until the noise began to fade behind them. Somewhere in the quiet distance, the day began to feel ordinary again. But for those who had seen what happened in the diner, in the press room, and in the hearts of the people involved, it was anything but. It was a reminder that strength isn't always about winning a fight. Sometimes it's about ending one the right way. In the weeks that followed the press conference, the initial wave of viral headlines began to settle. But for Keanu, the moment was far from over. He knew the video had sparked conversations around the world, and he saw an opportunity to turn those conversations into lasting change. Without announcing anything publicly, he began reaching out to advocacy groups and training organizations focused on police de-escalation. He read through proposals late into the night, highlighting programs that didn't just lecture, but actively trained officers in real-world conflict resolution, the kind that could prevent situations like the one at the diner from spiraling out of control. Within 2 weeks, quiet but significant donations began flowing to several organizations across the country. Keanu didn't attach his name to the funds. He wasn't interested in personal credit. The only thing that mattered was making sure the work got done. One of the programs he supported provided immersive role-play scenarios for officers, designed to put them in the shoes of civilians during tense encounters. Another focused on building community relationships, hosting events where officers could meet residents in casual, non-enforcement settings. Keanu believed both approaches were essential. Skills without trust meant little, and trust without skills was fragile. Meanwhile, Ronda reached out to him with an idea of her own. "What if we do something for the kids?" she asked over the phone. "Teach them about self-defense, sure, but also about self-respect. How to carry themselves so they don't become easy targets, not just physically but emotionally." Keanu immediately agreed. They arranged a youth seminar at a local community center, keeping it free for all who attended. Word spread quickly, and the registration list filled up in just 3 days. On the day of the event, more than 100 kids showed up, some with wide-eyed excitement, others shy and uncertain. Keanu spoke first, standing at the center of the gym floor. He talked about the importance of staying calm under pressure, of knowing when to step forward and when to step back. Ronda followed with hands-on demonstrations, breaking down techniques into simple, repeatable steps the children could practice with each other. The seminar quickly became more than just a class. Parents stood along the edges of the gym, watching as their children paired up to practice stances, balance, and controlled movements. Ronda's voice carried across the room, confident but encouraging, making sure every child understood that true strength was rooted in discipline and respect. Keanu moved quietly among the groups, crouching down to offer gentle corrections or a reassuring nod. A boy of about 10 wearing a faded hoodie struggled to keep his feet planted during a simple push drill. Keanu knelt beside him and whispered, "It's not about pushing harder. It's about standing your ground and believing you can't be moved." The boy tried again, this time holding firm, and his grin stretched from ear to ear. During a break, Ronda gathered the kids into a circle. "Here's the thing," she told them. "Self-defense isn't just for when someone grabs you or gets in your face. It's about defending your dreams, your self-worth, and your kindness. That's what makes you powerful." The children nodded, some absorbing the words deeply, others fidgeting but still listening. Keanu added his own thought. "The world can be noisy. People will try to pull you into fights that don't matter, just to make themselves feel bigger. The strongest thing you can do is walk away when you know it's right. That's not weakness, that's control." One of the parents, a single mother, later approached Keanu and Ronda. Her voice trembled as she thanked them for giving her daughter something to believe in. "She's been bullied at school," the mother admitted. "I think today was the first time she's felt capable." Ronda hugged her, promising that capability was like a muscle. It grew every time you used it. By the end of the seminar, the air in the room felt lighter. Children left with more than just a few practiced moves. They left with a sense of dignity and self-assurance. Keanu lingered near the door, shaking hands with parents, answering questions, and making quiet mental notes about how they could expand this program to reach more communities. As they packed up the mats and equipment, Ronda caught Keanu's eye. "We should take this on the road," she said with a half smile. He didn't hesitate before replying, "Yeah, we should." Over the next week, plans began to take shape. Keanu reached out to community centers in neighboring cities, offering to cover travel expenses and supply all the gear needed for free workshops. Ronda contacted friends in the sports world who could lend their expertise or help promote the events. Word spread quickly, and soon requests were pouring in from places they hadn't even considered. Small towns, schools in struggling neighborhoods, even youth programs overseas. They decided to start local, building a foundation before expanding. Each stop on their schedule would include not just physical training, but also a short discussion on empathy, conflict resolution, and the courage to speak up when something is wrong. Keanu insisted on keeping the focus on the message rather than himself. "If people only come because it's me, that's fine," he said to Ronda, "but they need to leave remembering the lesson, not the celebrity." When the first out-of-town seminar took place, it drew more than double the expected crowd. The small gym was packed shoulder to shoulder, with kids sitting cross-legged on the floor and parents squeezed along the walls. Keanu spoke about moments in life when walking away required more strength than standing and fighting. Ronda demonstrated a few techniques that could neutralize a threat without causing harm. In one exercise, she called a shy young girl to the front. The girl's hands trembled, but with gentle coaching, she executed a move that made the entire room cheer. Keanu leaned in and told her quietly, "See, you're stronger than you think." The smile that followed seemed to erase years of quiet self-doubt in an instant. Afterward, as they were loading up the van, Ronda remarked on how many parents had thanked them for showing their kids a different kind of heroism, one that didn't rely on aggression or dominance. Keanu nodded. "It's the kind of heroism anyone can carry," he said. "It just needs to be taught." By the end of the month, they had booked enough workshops to fill the next several months, with more waiting to be confirmed. Keanu kept his donations and sponsorships out of the spotlight, letting the story be about the kids and the lessons, not about him. But those who attended knew the truth. They had witnessed something more than a class. They had seen two people turn a tense, ugly moment in a diner into a movement for respect, confidence, and real change. The afternoon sun spilled through the tall windows of the community center, casting warm patches of light across the polished wooden floor. Keanu stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of fresh paint and the sound of children's laughter echoing down the hall. Years ago, he had quietly helped keep this place open when funding was on the brink of drying up. Now it was thriving. Walls decorated with colorful murals, bulletin boards filled with drawings, and the basketball court buzzing with energy. A group of kids noticed him almost instantly. Their game stopped mid-sklay, and in seconds they were crowding around him with wide-eyed excitement. One bold little boy stepped forward and blurted out the question the others were too shy to ask. "Is it true you stood up to a cop in a diner?" Keanu chuckled softly, motioning for them to gather closer. They plopped down on the floor in a circle, their curious faces turned toward him. "It's true," he said gently, but it wasn't about standing up to someone. It was about standing up for someone. He glanced toward the doorway where Ronda had appeared, leaning casually against the frame, watching with a faint smile. He continued, speaking in a tone that made the children lean in even more. "Sometimes, the strongest person in the room isn't the loudest or the biggest. It's the one who chooses respect when it's easier to lash out. Strength isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about not fighting at all." A few kids exchanged thoughtful looks, as if the idea was settling into them. One girl raised her hand and asked quietly, "But what if someone's mean to you?" Keanu nodded, recognizing the seriousness behind the question. "Then you remember this," he said, his voice steady. "Being kind doesn't make you weak, it makes you harder to break." The girl's eyes lit up at his answer, and a ripple of quiet nods passed through the circle. Ronda stepped forward then, crouching beside Keanu so she was at eye level with the kids. "And sometimes," she added, "it means knowing when to walk away. Not because you're scared, but because you're smart enough to know it's not worth giving the other person more power." A boy in a faded Lakers hoodie leaned forward. "So, like, you two didn't fight because you already won?" The corner of Rhonda's mouth curled upward. "Exactly," she said. "We won the moment we decided not to let anger decide for us." Keanu could feel the room grow still. The kind of stillness that only comes when something true has been spoken. These were kids who had faced their own versions of confrontation, in schools, on playgrounds, maybe even at home. If they carried even a sliver of this lesson forward, it would matter. He reached out, ruffling the boy's hair. "You'll have moments in life where you could shout, push, or hurt someone back, but you'll be surprised how powerful it feels to keep your cool and choose respect instead." From the back of the room, one of the youth volunteers called out that snack time was ready. The circle broke apart in a rush of chatter and footsteps, but a few lingered, giving Keanu quick hugs before running toward the tables. Ronda straightened, giving him a knowing look. "You've still got away with words." He smiled faintly. "I just speak what I wish I'd heard when I was their age." They began walking toward the exit together, the sound of laughter following them down the hall like a warm reminder of why they had shown up in the first place. Outside, the afternoon sun had softened into a gentle gold, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. Keanu and Ronda paused for a moment, watching a group of kids play an improvised game of tag near the basketball court. There were no cameras, no reporters, no noise from the world outside this block. Just a community breathing in peace for a rare moment. As they stepped off the curb, a man passing by recognized them. Instead of asking for a photo, he simply nodded and said, "Thank you for what you did." There was no need to clarify what he meant. Keanu gave a small nod in return, and Ronda answered with a quiet, "Take care." They walked side by side down the street, blending into the weekend crowd that had begun to gather around the food trucks parked near the corner. The smell of grilled corn and fresh tortillas filled the air. A couple of children from the center ran past them, laughing and chasing each other, their joy untouched by the heaviness of the diner incident. Keanu glanced at Ronda. "The strongest person in the room," he said softly, almost to himself, "is the one who chooses respect." She smiled, hearing the words from earlier repeated, as if they were meant to be carried forward. When they reached the end of the block, they didn't stop for goodbyes. There was no staged farewell, no orchestrated moment for an audience. They simply turned in opposite directions, knowing they'd cross paths again if the world decided it needed them to. The camera would have followed them until they were just two silhouettes among many. No red carpets, no spotlights, only a reminder that standing up when it matters is the quiet work of ordinary days. Stay humble, stay kind,